success. And that does mean you'll move. Yeah. Right. And so you see this happening in the United States is that the entrepreneurial types are flooding out of California. They're flooding out of the more socialist states because it's just too annoying and uncertain. And so, and it's very dangerous to get a flight like that because it's a small number of people, a small percentage of people who are entrepreneurial. And if you get rid of them, then you don't have anybody who wants to run businesses. So you said you were tempted in the 90s to move, but you went into the political realm instead. And tell me how your party affiliation has worked across the span of your engagement in the political world.
So when I decided to go into politics, of course, I'm not disposed to the ideology of the left. I've always been more on the conservative side of politics, although I find it odd because sometimes the federal conservatives think I'm too liberal and the federal liberals think I'm too conservative. So who knows what all that means. But so I looked for the party that most aligned with where I was, which was at the time the BC Liberal Party. The BC Liberal Party was born out of the old Social Credit Party when the Social Credit Party collapsed in 1991. And so I joined that party, and I was elected and served all the way through up until 2022 with that party.
And you served as a member of the Legislative Assembly.
A member of the Legislative Assembly, and like I say, in a couple of cabinet positions as well. Mm-hmm. And in 2022 was a very tough year for my family. My father passed in January, my father-in-law passed in February, and my mother passed in July. And so I was talking with Kim about just leaving politics. I mean, I don't need to be doing this.
Right.
And so we kind of had this discussion. And then along came a paper out of the federal government called the Farm Emissions Reduction Strategy.
Oh, yeah.
Right, which was this reduction of the nitrogen-based fertilizer and stopping cows from farting and belching because they think somehow, for some reason, that's going to change the weather, right? It's just nonsense. But it would have a very negative impact on my riding. And so I tried within the party to have a discussion about this, the party I was part of, and I kept getting shut down. So then...
Why?
Because the leader of the party, which is now the BC United Party, was saying we need to be leaders in fighting climate change. We need to be up on the forefront, and that was his whole motto in terms of what he wanted to do. And he wasn't willing to look at any evidence or have any discussions about anything that would have an impact on.
Do you think that was a vote-getting strategy or a commitment?
Of course it was. It was all about votes. It was a political party that was more about trying to chase where they thought they needed to be in the political spectrum as opposed to having any values. And so in December, in August, I should say, I put out a retweet of a Patrick Moore tweet, which questioned some of the role of CO2 and talked about the Great Barrier Reef. Didn't think...
You mean the thriving Great Barrier Reef?
Yes, that's
Barrier Reef?
The one that is, doing better than it ever has on record at the moment. I'd forgotten all about that. I even put this thing out there. So on Wednesday, my phone lights up and I was like, all these phone calls coming in. I was taking the day off because the next day was my birthday.
This was August 2022?
Yes, that was August 17th, 2022.
Okay,
so I made arrangements to talk to the leader on August 18th, which just happened to be my birthday. And I called him and he was angry. I get it. Nobody wants to be put off when there's an issue. You want to be able to deal with it right away. So I talked to him about it and I said, well, this is what the problem was and this is what I've been trying to do. And he said, look, you have a choice. You either have to parrot our party position on climate or you can't be part of our caucus. And I told him, I said, look, I was elected to represent my riding. I was elected to represent the people. And they're asking me and they want a voice that is going to be about helping them, not hurting them. And he said, I'm sorry, if that's the way you feel, that's fine. He hung up on me and half an hour later I was kicked out of caucus. And so that then created a very interesting problem for me because once again, I was back at the same place I was in the year 2000, which was I'm not happy with where things are going in the province. There's no chance of a political change because the both parties were basically fighting for the same territory on the left side of the spectrum.
Right.
And so what do? Do I leave the province? Do I retire and just leave the province? Or do I stay involved and actually try to change it? And so my wife actually said to me, no, you need to work on this. You need to stay involved. You've got my full support. So I looked at it and thought, okay, so I spent some time that fall, exploring some options and ultimately looked at the Conservative Party, which was just a very, small party representing only about 3% of the people in BC at the time and thought, you know what, it's time to resurrect it. It's time to actually try to do it. So I joined that in February of 2023 and took on the leadership at the end of March of 2023. And, we've gone from 3% in the polls to tied with the NDP, and some polls were actually ahead of the NDP right now going into the election.
Okay, there's a few things I want to delve into there on the more personal side. The first is, this is a terrible political conundrum that people should be aware of. And in my experience, there is an awful lot of narcissistic exhibitionism in politics. And that's not a useful brush to tar all politicians with, but it's something worth focusing on. So you see this in entertainment, you see it in the media, and you see it in politics. And the reason for that is that people who are temperamentally narcissistic, so they're extroverted and disagreeable, those are the personality predictors. And it's even worse if they're unconscientious. You're starting to border on psychopathy at that point. That's not good because you want to be the center of attention. You don't give a damn about other people. That's low agreeableness. And you're completely unreliable with regards to your word. That's a bad combination. There's a disproportionate number of people like that in any domain where there's a lot of public attention. Okay, so it's going to happen on the political front. Okay, so now, how do you get competent politicians? Well, this is a real problem because most competent people are already doing something, especially if they're, say, 40 and above. They've got a career that's usually well established, that's quite productive. Or if they happen to be overachievers, they've got quite a little empire. You know, I have some friends who are hyper successful, and I've talked to them about entering the political arena. And their comment often is, I would be less effective in the political role than I am doing what I'm already doing, because they'd have to put all that on hold as well. And so what that means is that not only are there a disproportionate number of self-serving narcissists in the political realm, is that it's very difficult to get people who are actually competent playing the political game, because it's difficult. It is very difficult. You have to have a very thick hide too to withstand the slings and arrows of your opponents and all the lies that come at you. Like, I don't think I can tolerate that, quite frankly. I don't think I have the constitution for it. In any case, you have this option because you had your own company, which you could expand more or less in accordance with your competence, but you decided repeatedly to stay in the political realm. You also said your wife supported you, and that's also very interesting, because it would have been easier in some ways for her to just have you around and to have all that stress out of your life. So what is it about the relationship you have with your wife that has held you two together in the political realm, and why is she supporting you, given the personal costs, let's say, that might be associated with that?
Well, and I guess it goes back when we were married, which was in 1995. We've been married now, 29 years, coming up on 30 years. Shortly after we got married, we talked about raising a family. And so unfortunately, my wife had cancer. And she had cervical cancer, which was caught at an early stage. And so she was treated, and she's now 24 years cancer-free, which is wonderful, right? I mean, today in British Columbia, I have doctors telling me that it was fortunate it happened back then, because that may not have been the same outcome today.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So that's the healthcare stuff, and we can get into that.
Yes,
so,
definitely.
And so my wife knew I wanted to have children. So yeah, she actually said to me at the time, shortly after in recovery, she said, I release you from our marriage because I know you would like to have children. And I told her, I said, we were married for better or for worse, with sickness and health, for richer, for poorer. So we're building this life together. And so we've been partners in everything that we have done throughout our life, whether it's going into business and these kinds of approaches. And so when it came to politics, she could see that there was an opportunity, but more importantly, she could see that there was a need in our society, which is why she pushed me so hard. She'd been pushing me for years to go into leadership, and I never wanted to, because it wasn't a burning desire. But there's a job that needs to be done, and I'm willing to step up and do that job. And so she, like I say, she was one who really pushed me to actually come in and do what I'm doing here today.
So let's talk about your experiences in politics. So you weren't, this wasn't a burning desire, but you became an MLA, a member of the Legislative Assembly, a representative of your constituency. What did you learn as an MLA that you hadn't learned as a business person? How did that expand your conception of the world?
It's interesting that the most stress I've ever felt, and believe me, I've talked to crowds of tens of thousands, right? And public speaking, as you know, can be a terrifying experience for many people. The most stress I've ever felt actually was when I hired my first person out of Ontario. Because that person now, I've uprooted them from their life. They're just out of school. They're coming over, and they're very reliant now on me, providing them with work and providing them with their future. And I took that experience from the work side and a lot about that from politics. And so the most rewarding thing in politics is the same thing, being able to find ways to be able to support people and help people. So for example, a grandmother that's trying to adopt their grandchild, helping them through the system to be able to do that. Or, two elderly parents that need to get a wheelchair for their 42-year-old daughter, and needing help to get through these systems, all those sort of things. There's a certain amount of reward that comes with doing that. And so when I was the Minister for Aboriginal Relations Reconciliation, with all the agreements I signed, there was one time where one of the chiefs who signed agreement was in tears, and I thought, oh my gosh, no, like, what have we done? This isn't good. And he said, no, you don't understand. 5 kids had attempted suicide the previous week, and tragically one had died. And this was an agreement that could make a difference, that could actually give those children hope, give them an opportunity to be able to build a future. There's a certain thing that's very rewarding in terms of being able to do those types of things for society. And so to me, that's what really drives what I'm doing, is because in politics, it's unlike anything else. There's nothing else, no other experience like it, where you can actually make decisions that can improve people's quality of life, that can help people to be able to become whoever it is that they're going to be. And so there's a real appeal to that for me personally, and it's very gratifying.
Republicans are Nazis. You cannot separate yourselves from the bad white people.
Growing up, I never thought much about race. It never really seemed to matter that much, at least not to me.
Am I racist?
I would really appreciate it if you
I'm
left.
trying to learn. I'm on this journey.
I'm going to sort this out. I need to go deeper undercover.
They gon' say I'm racist.
Joining us now is Matt.
I talked to this ex-Navy SEAL. I think it was a Navy SEAL. It's one of the American Special Forces, Jocko Willink. And Jocko's quite the bloody monster. He's about 3 feet thick, and he makes Joe Rogan isn't very tall, but he's tough and built. And, Jocko makes Joe look like a midget. He's a really tough guy. And he said that, when he was a kid, he could have been a pretty bad guy. He wanted to be a soldier from the time he was 3, and he's just wired that way, physically and mentally. And then he went off to military training and he started mentoring other people. And he said that was so much more rewarding than anything else he ever did, that nothing compared. And it's very interesting, because it's so easy, and this has to do with narcissism as well. It's so easy for people to feel that, if they had resources at their disposal, that they could do anything they want and be, let's say, more sexually attractive, and to have the advantages that they assume would go along with unlimited power and resources. And the pathological part of that is that there isn't anything that is more meaningful in the deep sense than being of service to other people. And that's a deep paternal instinct, and it's a mark of paternal maturity that you find gratification in that, right? And it's a sacrificial gratification, and it is the basis for a competent society. The lefties in particular, the postmodern types who insist that everything is about power, they just reveal their own narcissistic hand, as far as I'm concerned, in that philosophy, because everything isn't about power. If you think everything's about power, you haven't got anywhere near the core of what makes it valuable to be a human being, because you find all of that value in service to other people.
Well, this is something I see more, time and time again with the people on the left. Their ideology is more important than anything else. And so they will often sometimes be violent. They will take away rights of other people because they believe that the ends is justified. Yeah. And so it's crazy, when you look at what the negative impact will be for what they're actually doing, but they think it's for this greater good. And it's an ideology that I struggle with, quite frankly. I just something that just doesn't come to me naturally.
Yeah, well, and it would be all right as far as I was concerned if it was actually for the greater good, if that was actually at the bottom of it. But I don't think it is. I think that the easy moralizing that's part and parcel of the utopian strain of central planning thinking, it has very little to do with even the end. What it has to do with is the possibility that you can be identified in the moment with someone promoting a positive end, as someone promoting a positive end, and also with no sacrificial requirement on your part. If other people have to pay for your utopia, you don't have any skin in the game.
Yes.
And so we have these false solutions. See, this goes back to the environmental issue. It's like the left, the worldwide green left, is willing to sacrifice the poor of the present for their hypothetical poor of the future. And that borders on evil, or crosses the line as far as I'm concerned.
And I often think about it just from perspective of, people ask me why am I doing this, and I explain this, in terms of what I'm doing. But really, it's I'm planting my flag on a hill. I'm saying this is it. This is the fight that is worth fighting. This is the battle that is worth taking on, because it's the society I want to live in. Right? I don't want to live in that society that you've just described and that they're trying to build. I don't want to live in that. Because in my opinion, if that's what it's going to be, I'm going to look at going elsewhere. Yeah. I mean, why would I live there, right? It's not an enjoyable experience. It's not something that's fulfilling. Why would you want to live in that kind of misery? And so, to me, this is the fight that is worth taking on. Okay, so let's delve into the nitty gritty. This is another reason I wanted to talk to you too, because I'm always interested in talking to politicians who have done something that's difficult to believe. The first politician I spoke with publicly, this is way before things blew up around me, was Preston Manning. And I was interested in, it was also the first time I ran into cancel culture. It was so interesting because I'd run this little salon at the University of Toronto that was composed of graduate students and professors. And these were all friends of mine and colleagues, and very, very smart people. It was really fun. We met about every week. And I'd invite people in and we'd have a discussion, and the graduate students would join in. It was great fun. And then Preston Manning reached out to me because his son was in my class and liked it and suggested to his father that he make contact with me. So that happened. And so I invited him to come to this salon, and not to discuss political issues. I wanted to ask him how in the world he managed to create a political party from scratch, because that's really hard. What did you do to bring people together so rapidly? Because he rose from nowhere to become leader of the opposition, and then eventually
rejoined forces with the Conservative Party but it's a remarkable story. It happens now then in the West. You're kind of doing it again in BC. So I wanted him to come and just say how he did it, and a bunch of my professor friends wouldn't come. This was like in 2014, 2013. I thought, what do you mean you won't come? It's like he was leader of the opposition because they thought he was far right, which was absolutely preposterous. But in any case, I actually didn't care about his politics at that point. It was like, well, you build a political party. How do you do that? That's hard. And it's psychologically interesting. Anyways, 3 or 4 of my friends didn't show up, which, well, like I said, that was the first time I ran into cancel culture. Now, you didn't start a political party from scratch, but you did more or less. Like you took something that had a history, and Preston had done in some ways the same thing. How exactly have you managed to bring the Conservatives from essential obscurity up into the position where they're an actual contender for the throne in the next election? The elections win October
19th.
October 19th. Okay, so we're cutting close to the wire here. So what did you do? What's the nitty gritty of what you did, and why do you think it was effective?
There's no substitute for the formula of doing this. It's just hard work. And so the first time you go out and you talk to people, you have 7 or 10 or 12 people that come out. Then they like what they hear, and so they invite friends. Next time you come back, you've got 30 or 40 people. Next time you come back, you've got 70 or 80 people. And it's,
right, if you've hit it right.
If you've hit it right, if you're hitting the tones that they want to hear, and if what you're talking about is reflective in what they're looking for. And I also, I'm a firm believer that politics is not so much about policy, although policy obviously it drives everything that results from politics. But if I talk to people and give a speech, more often than not, most people won't remember much of what I've said.
Yeah.
They might latch on to a few little ideas or things that they've touched into, but what they get from it is a feeling.
Yeah.
It's whether it is, you're authentic, or whether it is they're happy, or whether it is they're angry, or whatever that may be. And that often drives people far more than...
they're trying to figure out if they can trust you or get something from you, let's say. Those might be the options.
It's whether or not you align, whether or not they're comfortable. And no one will ever be 100% aligned with everybody. But that has been a big piece of what we've been doing. And so right from day one of doing this, I hit the road. I just went out and lived out of a suitcase and went traveling everywhere around the province, connecting with people, talking to business people, talking to the average everyday person, and just slowly building up these groups of support. And it's been this multiplier effect that's just been growing.
Okay,
and what it's tapped into really is that desire for change, because there's people that are so upset with what is going on in society. I mean, when you've got these tent cities and these drug dens and all these things happening all over the place, and crime is rampant, and criminals are just getting a slap on the wrist and put back out on the street, and they don't like what's going on in the education system, and the economy, is sputtering, and the inflation, all that. People are just looking at it thinking, this is nuts. We need change. And so, we're tapping into that desire for change in many ways. That is in a way that people can look at and say, yes, that is the direction that we would like to go in.
Okay, so we talked earlier with regards to the Liberal Party, because you said you have to hit the right tones, let's say. Okay, but when we talked earlier about the Liberal Party, one of the things you pointed out was that, and your unhappiness with the fact that the Liberal Party, in your estimation, was using the climate issue as a means of garnering votes, and that was inappropriate. So what's the difference in your estimation between attending to the people that you're speaking with and providing them with a message that they need and want to hear, and playing a false populist game? Like, how do you balance the necessity of having principles in your discussions, in your speeches, and pandering to the crowd? And do you think you've walked that line successfully? How do you distinguish those things?
So what it has to come down to is just the principles of what you're trying to do. And so when you're talking to the crowd, you always have to talk from the perspective of, what's in your heart, what is the belief, what are the things that you are standing for? What is it that you've planted your flag on and saying, this is who we are, this is what we're going to do? And there's many people initially that were very skeptical, that weren't supportive, but as you start talking through the issues and showing the approach that you can take, more and more people open up to the idea and to what you're trying to do. So I haven't had to compromise any of the sort of values or principles that I've been trying to promote right from the beginning. We've carried forward with those same principles all the way through. And I think that's the only way that people can judge you as to whether you're authentic or not. Is, are you flip-flopping around on issues? Do you change? Are you putting you're putting your finger up in the air and trying to figure out where to go? Or are you standing on your values and plowing forward?
So one of the strangest things we've seen in recent years, and there are plenty of them, is this emergent confusion about just what constitutes a woman and a man. And we saw that played out pretty dramatically at the Olympics, and that's not over yet, because the boxer who won is going to sue Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling essentially for defamation and hate speech. I know that your party has been involved in clarifying the distinction between men and women with regards to, say, participation in sports and also for the protection of women's private spaces. You have a little badge there made of moose hide, I believe, that's emblematic of that. You want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. So this past spring, we introduced a piece of legislation, the first in Canada, that actually was called Fairness for Women and Girls in Sports. And what it's designed to do is say that biological men cannot compete against women and girls in sports in British Columbia. And the intent of that is not to exclude anybody, but not to take the rights of one people to give to the rights of another people. And I think, quite frankly, it's important that the rights of everybody should be able to be protected. And particularly for, women and girls, if they want to, for example, go after scholarships or whatever it is, and they want to be able to compete at high levels, they should be able to compete fairly. And the reason for actually bringing that in is because of, so in my riding, First Nations started up a program called the Moose Hide Campaign. And it actually started from a fellow named Paul Lessert, his daughter's now taken on Raven, and they've expanded it, gone right across the country. And we were actually, when I was minister, we actually gave them some seed money to get this program up and running and be able to expand. But what it is, it's about men talking to men about honoring and protecting women and girls and trying to end the violence against women and girls. And so, I wear this frequently in reflection of that, but it's also, part of the inspiration to be able to move forward and act like we did last spring. And the interesting part was the left wouldn't even allow it on the floor. They voted against it. They wouldn't even let it pass first reading. And first reading is usually just a formality and then it gets called for further debate. They wouldn't even let it get past first reading. They voted against it.
So Lyra Sapir tweeted out yesterday some data in the US that seemed to indicate that about somewhere around 8,000 minor girls in the last 5 years have used insurance money to obtain double mastectomies with the gender affirming front, which I have tweeted out and made a lot of noise about this. Is I think it's the worst form of quasi-criminal behavior that I've seen among the professional community since the horrors of World War II. And I know that Danielle Smith brought in legislation pretty early to address the issue of surgical transformation, sterilization, and so forth of minors in Alberta, and took a fair bit of flack for that. Any comments about that domain? It's related to what you just described.
So my perspective is, we need to make sure that we're supporting people whoever they are and make sure that we have that support in place, particularly through education, through the very challenging formative years in terms of having that support for them, having that support that even can extend to families. But as a province, I do not believe it is the right thing to do to support any kind of procedure that would sterilize a child. They are not old enough to make those kind of decisions. Who knows where they'll want to be in their future? And I just think as a province, we need to do everything we can to be able to protect children. And
children defined as what? Up to what age have you?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
It's at least 15, 16, but it could very easily be considered 18. But regardless of that, I just don't believe that as a province that we should be doing that. Like I say, having children is precious. Taking that away from children before they have their formative years and are able to understand who they are and what they want to be in life, I just think it's just the wrong thing to do.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll leave that issue at that, I think, for now. You said that when you first hit the road, your initial crowds weren't crowds at all. They were very small groups of people. And then it was essentially word of mouth, which is a much more powerful force than people think, that started the crowds to expand. So I'm curious, what was it in your attitude and approach that allowed you not to be demoralized when you were first going out and speaking to very small groups of people? Why did you conclude that this was worth pursuing despite the fact that, you were starting from a 3% baseline? Like, were you curious, or did you believe that much in your principles, or what is it that made you think that was worth pursuing?
So as I had mentioned before, right, I looked at this from perspective of we need change, and I didn't want to just, live with it. And so for me, this was a matter of going out and presenting an option. And I was fully prepared to go through. If it didn't connect with people. I was okay with that. It's not,
okay.
I'm not on some...
Why were you okay with that?
Because it's not about narcissism. It's not about, any sort of anything for me personally. This is just, to me, it's the right thing to do. We need to get society going in a different direction. So I was perfectly prepared, and I still am prepared, right, to go forward. These are the things I stand for. This is what I'm trying to do in British Columbia, and try to convince people to support us because it's the right thing to do.
Right. And if that doesn't work, you can go back to your other life.
If it doesn't work, well then, I can sleep well at night. I can know that I stood for the values and principles that I feel were important and that I think I want to be able to see reflected in our society. Okay,
so you mentioned when we met today, you also said that you're not using pre-prepared speeches. So what do you do? What do you do when you speak then, and how do you decide what you're going to talk about?
Often I read the crowd.
Okay.
But many times there's set things that I want to talk about,
Okay.
the values and things that we want to do, whether it's changing the education system, whether it is, ending decriminalization and safe supply, that kind of thing, whether it's getting our economy going. It's a significant change that's needed in our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is absolutely crazy. We need to be looking at those European models, for example, that are universal healthcare, but delivered by both government and non-government agencies. Right? So there's all these changes. So I'll talk about those. I'll talk about what the problems are, and I'll talk about what I think the solutions can be in terms of what we do as a society. And it depends on, which crowd I'm in, whether it's, up in the north or in the dairy, or whether it's down on the lower mainland or on the island, I don't change what I'm saying. I change the topics that I may be talking about and focusing on, just because, I believe those topics are more relevant for a crowd, say, in Victoria than it is for a crowd in say, Fort St. John.
Yeah, well, it's been remarkable to watch what's happened to the healthcare system particularly in the last 5 years. I think my wife, we live in Ontario, I think my wife has been without a physician for 4 years, and my physician is moving, and I have no idea how I'm going to replace him fundamentally. I mean, I have options, obviously, and options that most people don't have, but it's very, very interesting to me to watch what's happening to the healthcare system, because it's been a real pride point for Canadians, and even more specifically for the left, the success of Canada's socialized Medicare system. And it's not an easy problem to solve, partly because even the concept of healthcare in some ways is ridiculous. It's much too comprehensive to be considered as something that's a unit. But we have free healthcare in Canada. It's not free because we pay taxes, but it's also not free in another very fundamental way, which is that dying waiting is not free. Wondering, having, for example, when my daughter needed an ankle replacement when she was 16, the waiting list was 3 years. And she was essentially walking around at that point on 2 broken legs. It's like 3 years, hey? That's not 3 years, that's death. Because there's no way you walk around on 2 broken legs for 3 years and make it through that. That doesn't happen to people. And so the waiting list approach to cost is not effective. And so in Canada now we're in a situation where you can't get the care you need often. You can't even get on a waiting list to see a specialist that would provide that care. And you can't have private insurance to cover you, and you can't pay for it. So the rationing system in Canada for healthcare is you get to die waiting. Yeah. Right, that's not free.
Well, in British Columbia, we don't actually collect these stats because government likes to operate in secret, which is a whole different topic. But looking at the national stats, we have the number of people dying in British Columbia today on a daily basis, waiting for diagnostic services or surgery, is comparable to the number of people who are dying from the opioid crisis. And nobody's talking about it.
Yep.
And it's crazy. Yep. I find that completely unacceptable.
Say that again.
The number of people who are dying on a waiting list for diagnostic services and surgery in British Columbia is comparable to the number of people who are dying of overdose deaths in British Columbia because of the opioid crisis.
Right. Well, it seems to me that in Canada right now, and I truly believe this, that there are so many things happening that at a level that's actually scandalous that no one can keep up. I've really watched this with Trudeau because it's something remarkable for me to see. Like about every 2 weeks, the Trudeau government has a scandal of sufficient magnitude under normal circumstances to collapse a competent government, and yet nothing happens. And then the next scandal comes along.
It's because people have lost faith in reporting because there's so much information out there. So one of the things I want to do is change politics forever in British Columbia. And what I want to do is we have what's called freedom of information requests, right? You have all this information, which is public information. And if you want it, you have to pay a certain amount of money and you can apply to access it. And months later, you might get some redacted document, right, that you get. I'm going to change that. I'm going to get rid of freedom of information requests because I'm going to make all of the information that can be made public.
Like they did in Lithuania.
Of the Freedom of Information Officer should be to say what can't be made public.
Right.
Give the people the facts. Give them the information. And then it's no longer politicians that are giving spin, but politicians that are responding to the facts. And you can judge political parties based on facts as opposed to based on whatever spin they're giving. Try to build some confidence and a little bit, restore some of that confidence back in government and government institutions that's being lost and continually eroded, particularly because of what's going on with the politics of the left.
Okay, do you think that you have garnered sufficient management and administrative experience to run a province from the combination of your work as a private entrepreneur, an MLA, you were a cabinet minister for a while. So how do you feel about your competence as an administrative leader? But then also equally importantly, what makes you convinced that among the ranks of the Conservative Party, you have enough talent to formulate a cabinet that will be made of people who are competent enough to do the job properly? I know, for example, when the Democrats took power in Washington, I know this for a fact, that they knew amongst themselves that they didn't have anywhere near enough competent people to fill the positions that needed to be filled. Hence the situation and part of the problem with the situation in the US. But it is a big problem. It's like you're running a huge enterprise. It's certainly equivalent to a major corporation, like a major international corporation.
85 billion, 89 billion.
Right, yeah. Right. So why you? What do you bring to the table as not only as a leader who can speak directly to people, but more importantly, as an administrator and a manager? And how do you know that you have people around you that can actually do this job credibly?
Well, I'm perfectly willing to admit that, I'm probably going to make a few mistakes. That's just, no one's perfect. However, what I do know is I know how government works. I know the process of how government works. I'm more than capable from my perspective of being able to manage and govern and direct both the people involved as well as the bureaucracy, which is a huge part of the change that is going to be needed in terms of getting things done. We've got a very good group of people that are running for us with an enormous variety of skill sets, everything from lawyers and doctors to prominent business people, very successful business people, entrepreneurs to farmers, to local politicians. And I also have a handful of people who have been in government before, not in cabinet. But one other person has been in cabinet, but have been, as MLAs. And so I've got a good mix of people to be able to draw from that I think have the experience that we need to be able to move forward the agenda. On top of that, of course, one of the big pieces is the transition, right? You're coming into this, and the NDP have had 7 years to put all of their people in place and all their ideology driven and infiltrated throughout the system. So we need to come in, and I've got a transition team that we've already been building and working on to come in and help us with making some changes that are needed so that we have that supportive layers within the bureaucracy to be able to push forward our agenda as well. And so, it's going to be a lot of change. Believe me, there's a lot of work that needs to be done over a very short period of time. But I've said to my colleagues that are running for me, I've said, look, be prepared for a lot of work. You're going to be putting in long hours. There is a lot to do in a short period of time. And, I'm going to be, I guess you could say, quite a taskmaster to make sure that it gets done. Yeah.
Well, you have that combination of entrepreneurial, business, and political experience that's relatively rare to have all three of those. So that's something you definitely have under your belt. Let's talk about education for a minute. So I want to put forward a couple of propositions and tell me what you think about them. So I've been speaking with Republican governors and the Republicans I know in the US, and that's quite a few of them, as well as conservatives in Canada, about the K through 12 education system, as well as the higher education system. But let's start with K through 12. So I want to run another proposition by you. So I worked in the universities for a long time, and I saw how they worked. And I worked at Harvard, which was an unbelievably functional institution in the 1990s. I'd never been anywhere like it. McGill was good. I went to school as a graduate student at McGill, and I had a very good educational experience there. And McGill did a lot of things right, but Harvard was really knocking it out of the park when I was there in the 90s. The senior faculty were the smartest people I'd ever met and the most educated. The undergraduates were unbelievably high quality. Like a third of them were the smartest kids you'd ever seen. And the other 2/3 were contenders, And so, the place really served excellence. And then you could see the edges of the politically correct movement manifesting itself around the fringes in the 1990s, but they really didn't have any real power. The last time I was down in Boston was about a month ago. I met some of my former colleagues, great people, really. And they've all joined the free speech movement at Harvard, and they set themselves at odds with the administration, which is an appalling thing to see. And that's Harvard. And then I was at the University of Toronto for a long time, and it made a lot of noise about excellence, but really had no real fundamental clue about what it meant or how to pursue it. But I had a very good time there, and I liked it a lot. But I learned a lot about what was wrong with higher education. And emblematic of what's wrong with higher education is the faculties of education. Okay, they're full of educational psychologists, and that's a corrupt discipline, and almost everything that it's produced is a lie. Whole word learning, that's a lie. That anti-phonics movement, the self-esteem movement, that's a complete bloody lie. And all it did was produce a pack of narcissists. Multiple intelligences, that's a complete bloody lie. Like, the educational psychologists have been a negative influence consistently for 60 years. And the faculties of education have arguably the worst students in the university and arguably the worst faculty. Now, why is that a problem? Well, they're radical and incompetent. That's a big problem. In the United States, they control 50% of the state budgets. 50%. Okay. And the faculties of education are why the conservatives lost the culture war. And the conservatives have been too blind for 4 generations to see this. And there's a nexus point. The faculties of education have a hammerlock on teacher certification. And I don't understand that. There's no evidence whatsoever that their training regimens produce qualified teachers. None. We also even know what makes a teacher effective. Conscientiousness is the trait. High cognitive ability and conscientiousness, you could select them. Why? What's your view of what's corrupted the K through 12 education system, and what do you think might be done about it? Because I think that the faculties of education should have the right to certify teachers stripped from them. It would kill them, and they deserve it. And I think the reason that classic liberals and the conservatives have lost the culture wars because the faculties of education have had a hammerlock on teacher certification. So I know that's a mouthful and it's a radical analysis and a radical proposition, but I'm wondering what you think of what's going on in the K through 12 system.
So I'm smiling because when I think about the education system, the first thing that comes to mind is our education system in British Columbia today is teaching kids what to think. It's not teaching kids how to think. It's not teaching kids how to be critical thinkers. And that is, to me, is the fundamental problem within the system itself. And so there's material that is within our education system, which is designed for more of an indoctrination as opposed to actually providing kids with the skills they need. Kids are coming out of school and university professors, college specialists are telling me they're not prepared for entering post-secondary.
They can't read and they don't know anything.
Some people can't even write their own name. And so I look at that system, I think, okay, what is needed to start with is we need to do a full review of all the material that's being made available for teachers. And look at it from a perspective of being neutral.
Who would review it? Do you know how would you go about that?
You've got to put a team together that's going to review it.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be some educators, it's going to be some people that are not educators who are going to go through and look at the material from that critical lens. And so, for example, there's, I think, a book in grade 4 math, I think it's called Math That Matters. And the math is correct, 2 + 2 = 4. But the language being used is all about environmentalism.
It's all social justice oriented.
Exactly. It's all about, anti-development and that whole side of things. So we wonder when the kids go to school, why we've got this bent. And because this is what they've been taught.
Yeah.
This is what they've been indoctrinated
from day one for 12 years. Yeah.
So we're going to try to change all of that, right? In terms of that material, make sure it's all neutral in terms of how the information is being provided. And quite frankly, we need to bring in something, that I think is critical. Fiscal management, teaching kids about how money actually works, compound interest, and, debt and all those sort of things. So those will be some big shifts that we need to do. And the fight.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that. So why neutral exactly? Like, why not unabashedly anti-communist, unabashedly pro-free market, unabashedly Western tradition of freedom? Because I think it seems to me that one of the errors that conservatives and classic liberals have made consistently across time is a kind of apologetic neutrality. So I'll give you one example. So at the University of Toronto, in my personality course, so it's a psychology course, second-year psychology course, I used to teach the kids about what happened in Stalinist Russia. And I did that because I used Alexander Solzhenitsyn as an example of existential psychology, because he was an existential psychologist like Viktor Frankl. Now, one of the shocking things to me was that none of my students had ever heard about what had happened in Russia between 1920 and 1989, let's say. Even though we just about torched the planet and we fought a Cold War over it. They had no idea what the Stalinists had done. And so that's a good example of something where even neutrality isn't sufficient. It's like the communists were brutal, genocidal murderers wherever they've set up shop. It's happening again in Venezuela. It's still happening in Cuba. It threatens all of South America. China is a complete bloody catastrophe on the ideological front, and they're permeating the world. It's a catastrophe. And our education system tells students nothing about that. And, conservatives this is particularly true in Canada, although it's starting to shift, is that they're so terrified of being demolished by the woke mob and also of being accused of something approximating social conservatism is that they do take refuge in something like neutrality. But I'm not sure it's time for neutrality anymore.
It depends what you mean by neutrality.
Yeah, okay.
In terms of it. And by the way, regarding the cancel culture only works if you allow them to cancel you.
Yes.
You just have to stand up and say, take a hike. And it goes away, right? Because if they can't cancel you, then they have to find something else to do. So, but with Garden School, what I mean by neutrality is not that we won't teach about communism, that we won't teach about the Holocaust, because we will. We need to show
No, you
that
won't.
from a perspective of this is the facts that happened. This is the evil that happened. This is
No,
the
you
damage
won't.
that was done
You
with
won't
it.
teach shit.
Not just from an ideological perspective, but from
You
a facts
won't
base.
teach shit.
And that's what I mean by neutral. I don't mean neutral as we won't talk about communism, we won't talk about
These people don't
fascism,
know
we
how
won't
the
talk
real
about
world works.
democracy or capitalism, whatever the case may be. We will, but in terms of providing facts and information, so that the kids can look at this and come to their own conclusions. And because you're going to have people still on the left and the right, and families are still going to have lots of influence. And I think that's okay. That's a rounded society. And I think where society runs into trouble is it gets too far on any one particular side. The pendulum swinging back and forth. And so you want to try to keep that as much as you can into a place where it creates positive opportunities and people who are informed and critical thinkers and are able to look at information that comes forward with a critical eye and ask the questions based on facts that they have, that, particularly from our history. And so that's what I'm hoping our education system will become.
So I have mixed feelings about this, because for a conservative to stand up and say all the institutions that we relied on the West are corrupt, in some ways plays directly into the hands of the leftist radicals who say all the institutions in the West are irreparably corrupt, right? And this is a real problem. It's a real problem. And then I look at the K through 12 education system and I think, well, we could look at what happened at Twitter when Musk took it over. He fired like 85% of the people. No decrement in Twitter performance. In fact, quite the contrary. But he had to do that in order to dispense with the ideological corruption, because it was that deep. It's like, it strikes me as highly probable that that's the case with the education system, and because it's been 4 generations of this. So
in British Columbia, so I was a school trustee for 3 years.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there was one of the schools I looked after. There was 2 grade 4 classes. All the kids going into one class were at or about a grade 3 reading level and left at or about a grade 4 reading level. All the kids going into the other class were at or about a grade 3 reading level and left at or about a grade 3 reading level.
Right.
And so I looked at it and went, wait a second, this teacher is obviously, there's something going on here. If this is happening year after year after year, there's obviously
performance problem.
Performance problem. Well, in the education system of British Columbia, you can't remove somebody for bad performance. It's not possible. I think there's only one person since 1986, and in a system that's got 42,000 teachers. I mean, as you know, there's going to be a certain percentage just by statistics that are going to be problematic.
65% of managers add negative net value to their companies.
Exactly.
Right,
That's why the old rule, 20% did 80% of the work done, right?
Exactly.
In terms of it. So you look at this and you think, okay, this is a real problem, but because the union has such a lock on this, it is extremely difficult to change that. So there are some shifts that I am looking at and considering in terms of the education system, but I need to start with the basics first and then see how that can improve, and then look at what the next level needs to be in terms of making those shifts. And the reason why I'm saying that is there's only so much change people will accept.
Absolutely.
As you know, right? Most people won't accept any change, except when you get these moments in time, like I think we have in British Columbia, where people are expecting and wanting change.
Right, so you have a window.
So you've got a window to be able to do a number of things, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to, and so there's a lot of change that's needed. And so how far do you push on some of those things before you prevent yourself from actually being able to get changes that you need in other areas?
Well, you're going to be in the same position as Polyev, I think, because whatever you think the state of the British economy is, or the British Columbian economy, it's worse.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be dumped on you the moment you take office, assuming that you win. And the same thing's going to happen to Polyev. So you're going to have the problem of having to make radical changes while simultaneously having to bear the burden of every bad decision that's been made in the last, who knows how long, at least 7 years. So yeah, that's a very tough road to hoe.
And the number one thing we need to do, right? I mean, there's all these changes we need on the social side and structure within government and all that kind of stuff. But the number one thing we need to do is we actually need to get our economy going. I mean, they've driven the economy into the ground. And so we're going to basically have a bit of a slogan, which is just to get stuff done. I might use a different word than the S word.
Yeah.
But we just have to do this, right? We have to get the permits out the door. We have to, change that structure in place so that we can actually start driving the economy and creating the environment where people want to stay in British Columbia and to give them hope for that they can build their future. So that's going to be a big focus while we are doing the structural changes on all the social side, like on health and education, the stuff we need to change on the criminal codes and the stuff we need to change, in the drugs and that whole side of things. So there's a lot that's going to be going on all at the same time. But as a priority, you've got to think, okay, we've got to be able to pay for this. We're running an $8 billion deficit, the largest deficit in BC's history. We're running a 10% deficit just about. And you want to be able to give tax relief. You got to get rid of things like the carbon tax. It's another $3.5 billion that are taken out of people's pockets. So you've got to do that structural change. But at the same time, you need the money to do it. So you have to be able to get the environment where people will want to invest in British Columbia again and create those jobs and drive, quite frankly, wage growth, which is another big factor that needs to be done to deal with affordability.
Okay, so I wanted to close with a discussion of priorities because I thought it would be useful for you to tell your voters, what your priorities are in the near future if you become premier? And you just alluded to that. So let's close by delving into priority. So you said that your first priority is going to be to get the economy moving. And so what relatively short-term measures do you think that you could take that would give you that 80% return for 20% investment? Like, what are the egregious errors that are being committed right now that you could in principle reverse rapidly, that would signal to people that if those who can will now be allowed and encouraged to do? What could they look forward to in the first 3 or 4 months?
So we have 17 mines that are either permitted or about to be permitted in British Columbia. That represents a $38 billion investment. That'll generate between 20 and 30,000 jobs with an average wage and benefit of 138,000 a year. And we'll add 500 to 800 billion to British Columbia's GDP over the life of those mines. So we're just going to get those things out the door and get started. Obviously, there's going to be work with First Nations and things that need done. That's going to be a priority to get done. There are 3 more natural gas pipelines permitted to the coast. And those permits will start expiring in November of this year. They've already had 5-year extensions. They can't apply for another extension. So on day 1, we are going to pass an order in council to give a 10-year extension to those permits, because it's a linear project. They don't need to go through. Nothing has changed. We're going to be then changing the need for using electricity for compression of LNG, of natural gas, to using natural gas for compression. So these are the basic things that we'll do right at the beginning to start getting the investment back into British Columbia. Then there's some structural changes on forestry we need to do. And then, of course, there's some structural changes we need to do just from the economic side, period. For example, in British Columbia, it takes 2 years or longer to get something as simple as a warehouse built. South of the border, it's 3 months. Yeah. And so we need to strip away. So
everybody just moves south of the border.
So we got to strip away all that permitting process and go to a place that's one project, one permit. Right. And clean up a bunch of these things. So there's all of that stuff is designed to set the stage. But then the key is you still have to get people to invest. You still get people that want to do work in British Columbia. And so you set the stage, and then you have to build the confidence that they can come in and actually make
for the long run.
For the long run, and know that when they're putting $38 billion into the ground for various projects, that they have a reasonable expectation for return within a reasonable time frame. And and the certainty when they go in that the land's not going to shift from underneath them.
Okay, so if I was an environmentalist radical listening to what you just said, I'd be rubbing my hands in anticipation of all the protests that I could mount. So if you go ahead with rapid, what would you say, restructuring so that these projects could take place, you'll be facing a substantial amount of pretty radical opposition. And so that's a very difficult thing to deal with, right? Because people have a right.
Except for one thing.
Yeah.
This is a democratic society, at least it should be. And if we're given the mandate to do this, then that's what we will do. It's not like we're not being up front and talking to people and saying, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. And we will have the people's mandate, should we be elected, to actually be able to implement these things. Now, we're not throwing environmental standards out the window. Of course, we're going to meet the environmental standards. We want to make sure that we are good citizens of our environment and of the land that we have. But we're not going to be jumping through these enormous hoops and then barriers that are put in place that have been intentionally put in to stymie the opportunity to actually do anything. And so if there's going to be people that are going to protest it, I get it. There's going to be.
But they're not going to stop you.
People have the right to protest. If they want to fill the lawn of the legislature, that's fine. You know what? And I list them if there's reasonable arguments to be made. But if they're just going to be, just protesting because they want everybody to be naked running under the trees, fill your boots. I'm not interested in going down that path. But if they want to come forward with reasonable things that we need to address, okay, we'll look at that. But the one thing I will not allow is I'm not going to allow hate, and I'm not going to allow, violence in terms of our society. Like what we're seeing right now, for example, the anti-Semitism that is going on in British Columbia, and the protests where people are calling for the destruction of the Jewish people and the genocide of Jewish people. Wait a second. That is hate by its very definition. That should not be allowed in our society. It should not be, it needs to be stopped. Government needs to step up and say, no, that is not acceptable. Because if that's allowed, where does that carry on? Where does that go? I was talking with one Jewish family. She's 67. Her mom, grew up through the Holocaust, and she's making plans to leave British Columbia. And I asked her why, and she said because what's happening today reminds her very much of the stories her mother told about 1932 in Germany.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. I never thought I'd see this in Canada.
That scares me. And so that's a fundamental shift that we need to do to get back to a society that is open, that is fair, that is treating people, fairly and safely. And it's a shift, on that side that is desperately needed.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize our conversation. And for everybody watching and listening, I think I'll continue to talk to John Rustad about the philosophy of conservatism and small L liberalism in some detail on the Daily Wire side. So and to contrast that with the radical utopianism of, let's say, the progressive neo-Marxist left, I'd like to go more into the philosophy of government and governance. So we'll do that on the Daily Wire side. to summarize, essentially, well, British Columbia is a province where the war between the utopian socialists and the free market classic English liberals really is particularly market intense. And the utopian socialist green types, anti-human green types, I think, have had the upper hand for a good long time in British Columbia. And there's been a fair amount of very little environmental progress and a fair amount of economic havoc wreaked as a consequence. And so you want to take the reins, let's say, and return the province to something approximating a free market orientation. Your primary considerations upon taking the reins of the government will be economic. You want to get rid of the obstacles in the way of allowing the people of British Columbia to have a high quality economic future. So you talked about mines, you talked about forestry, you talked about fossil fuels. It's low hanging fruit in a sense if you can clear away the red tape and keep the protesters at bay, at least stop them from stopping everything. And so that's your short-term plan. On the longer term, you're looking at education reform, healthcare reform, maybe some additional fortification of property rights. And you think that you can get the economic ball rolling in relatively short order. You think that you're the man for the job, at least in part because you made a decision to run on principle, even though you don't exactly need the job. You have private enterprise experience as an entrepreneur and as a manager. You were an MLA for a good period of time, and you're in the cabinet. And you think that you have enough people around you so that you could do a competent job. Is there anything that I missed as a summary?
That's a pretty good summary from my perspective. And I always like to say, what we stand for is just to stand for what's right and fight for the average everyday person. When you look at the class differences, the left has really become a party of elites and environmentalists, and the average person is being left out of that equation entirely. And so that's got to be a focus of us as a government.
It's so funny.
Sure.
You and I, we're about the same age, and when we were younger, it was pretty obvious that the NDP was a working class party run in large by labor union leaders. The Conservatives were the party of big business, and the Liberals were sort of in the middle, and everyone knew that, and everybody played that game in a pretty straight way, I would say. It's pretty damn weird that Pierre Poilievre is attracting old people in work boots now, and that the Conservatives have become the party of the working class.
And in British Columbia, we are getting a large number of people from the NDP actually coming over and joining us and being part of our party. I've got a former NDP MLA running for us. The former leader of the Green Party has come out and endorsed policies and approaches that we're doing because they just make sense as opposed to much of this ideology that, quite frankly, is going too far. So we put together a very interesting coalition in British Columbia, and we call it conservatism.
Yeah.
And we call it the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But really, like I say, it's more of that just standing for what's right instead of, on ideologies.
Right. All right, sir. Well, good luck on the October 19th election. I'll be watching that with great interest and not a little trepidation, because it would really be an awful thing to have the ports of British Columbia closed for Canada to aid the world with, let's say, energy provision. That would really be quite the catastrophe for many people, not just the people in British Columbia, for the Japanese, arguably for the Europeans. Yeah. So I really hope that...
Right across the world.
You bet. Right across the world.
It is our hope that we can bring back just a little common sense, even though common sense isn't very common, but just get back to the basics.
Yeah.
And open up our province and, quite frankly, help that to open up the country as well.
Yeah.
In terms of what can happen and what should happen for what I truly believe is the best country in the world.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, sir. Very much. Very good talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you to everybody watching and listening. Another, what would you say, slice of the ongoing culture war making itself manifest in what should be and easily could be Canada's richest province. British Columbia is a remarkably beautiful place with an immense amount of opportunity and possibility, and it's a real catastrophe to watch it degenerate into this idiot, counterproductive socialist utopia, so to speak, and put the entire economy of the country at risk. So I'm hoping that there'll be some change on October 19th. Thank you to everybody who's watching and listening. Thank you to the film crew here in Fairview, Alberta, where we managed to do this live. So that was quite an unexpected bonus and a welcome opportunity. And thanks again, sir, for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed our chat.
We call out for meaning from a universe that's indifferent to us. This version of the absurd threatens to rob us of our sanity. Here be lions and dragons. Here be cold and dark and emptiness. And that's uncomfortable. If we're going to tell ourselves the truth, that search for meaning in a world that doesn't obviously present us meaning is the world that we need to embrace if we're going to live honestly and authentically.
Well, I can tell you what made itself manifest as evidence for me. Hello, everybody. I'm talking today to Dr. Jack Symes. He's a public philosopher and researcher at Durham University. He's also known as a podcaster, the Panpsychast Philosophy Podcast, which is one of the UK's most popular higher education programs. He's also the editor of the Talking About Philosophy book series. So he's written and edited a couple of books on the philosophy of consciousness, and then books that describe the concept of God and also the morality of the God that's being, portrayed. That doesn't mean that Dr. Symes is a religious believer, by the way, and the discussion that we had that you'll watch, what would you say? What did we delve into? Conceptualizations of consciousness. Also, we discussed what do we have in the popular culture now with regards to the arguments between the atheists and the believers, let's say. Well, we have an argument about perhaps whether or not God exists. There's an argument underneath that, which is, well, what exactly do you mean? Who is this God that you're discussing? How is he characterized? And is that characterization reasonable on the theist or the atheist side? And that's what we delved into. You know, before you can have an argument about belief, you have to specify what it is that you're actually talking about. Now, one of the things we alluded to, let's say, in the conversation was the fact that the God that's criticized by the atheist types, the materialist reductionist atheist types, is somewhat of a straw man and a parody God, and that's not helpful, because if we want to get to the bottom of things, we have to make sure that we're actually arguing about the right thing, let's say, rather than to reduce it to a kind of foolishness that can be easily dispensed with. Well, that would be fine if you could make that reduction properly, but it's not fine at all if you have to reduce it without knowing what you're talking about. And that actually happens to be the case for much of the argumentation that's put forth by the atheists, is the God they're dispensing with is not the God that's portrayed in the relevant work. So anyways, we walked through that kind of differentiation. And so what's happening in the world right now, in the West in particular, there's a crisis of belief. What we believe fundamentally is up for grabs. Well, there's an ongoing intellectual conversation about how to re-specify that. And this conversation was part of that. So to the degree that you're interested in participating in that and understanding it, then, well, this is the conversation for you. Well, so you have 3 books, one on consciousness, 2 on God, one associated more with existence itself, and the other, I think it's the newest one, Defeating the Evil God Challenge. Maybe we'll start with consciousness. So tell me a bit, and everybody who's watching and listening, how you approach the problem and how you conceptualize it. Let's talk about that. I've done a fair bit of reading on the topic of consciousness. So I'm very curious to hear your take on it.
Well, what I thought was interesting, Jordan, is this interview you did with Elon Musk recently. And he actually expressed a view that's pretty close to mine. He explained how in the beginning, 13.8 billion years ago, there was just hydrogen. And all of these physical processes evolve over time. And somewhere in that picture, consciousness must come into it. And he raised this question. He said, well, is it everywhere or is it nowhere? Consciousness is that feeling you get that when you see your parents at the school gate, or that drop in your stomach when you realize you've said something you shouldn't, perhaps. And although that process of thinking 1 + 1 = 2, those are all conscious experiences, and they make up the fabric of our worlds. And just to understand the value of that, try and imagine your life without consciousness. It would be a meaningless wasteland, as the philosopher Gregory Miller puts it. So there's nothing more valuable to us. And as George Orwell said, it's difficult to see what's on the end of your nose. It's a constant struggle. So that thing that the person watching this, or you hearing my voice now, these are all conscious experiences, and they don't seem to be captured in the language of mathematics and geometry, i.e. the language of physics. Galileo put consciousness outside of the picture when it comes to physical science in order for science to make all the incredible advances that it has. And so our question is, where does consciousness fit into the scientific picture of the world that, on the whole, people seem to be accepting in Western societies? My view is that you should put consciousness at the bottom, that consciousness has to be there from the beginning. You need some rudimentary consciousness for evolution by natural selection to play with. In the same way you need some physical properties to make eyes and ears, you need conscious properties or particles to make the kinds of interesting consciousness that you and me enjoy.
So are you coming at this primarily from a philosophical perspective? And to what degree is your viewpoint informed, for example, by biology and neuroscience?
I'd say my view is 100% philosophical, but it goes on the basis of the things that are missing in neuroscience and biology. Neuroscience and biology are the wrong sort of methods of understanding consciousness. You can't scan someone's brain and see where the color red is. It's not going to come up. It's a different kind of thing. It's a private experience that isn't available to third-person observation. So anyone who thinks that neuroscience or biology is going to tell us where consciousness comes from just doesn't understand what science is. Science can't tell us about the inner nature of what particles are. It tells us what particles do. This is known as the easy problem of consciousness, right? The easy problems are the problems of trying to map out what David Chalmers calls the neural correlates of consciousness. So I give you a sharp punch to the chest, right? And your brain lights up in a certain way. And so I can go like, that part of your brain gives rise to these experiences. But it still doesn't tell me where consciousness itself comes from. So that's what's always going to be missing from biology and neuroscience.
And the hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers formulates it?
He gives it in 2 words: explain consciousness.
So, okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions about that, because I've thought for a long time that the formulators of the hard problem of consciousness are actually wildly optimistic in a sense, because I don't really think they are tackling the hard problem of consciousness. I think the hard problem of consciousness is distinguishing consciousness from being itself. I have a hard time distinguishing consciousness from being. And it's also quite difficult in some ways to distinguish consciousness from intelligence. So let me delve into that on the consciousness side a little bit to begin with. So I've spent a lot of time studying comparative mythology and also binding that analysis with my knowledge of neuroscience. And so I don't want to generate interpretations of cosmogonic narratives that are run in contradiction to what I know on the neurobiological side. And I like that way of triangulating, so to speak, because it seems to me the probability that ancient mythology and modern neuroscience will come to the same conclusions by chance is very low, because they're so disparate in terms of their mechanisms of generating knowledge. So in the typical cosmogonic myth, which seems to involve consciousness, you have 3 fundamental attributes of being and becoming. You have something that's equivalent. It's usually represented by a paternal figure, a figure of order, a father, a figure of light. Those are all symbolic associations. And it represents something like an extant structure of interpretation. And then there's something to be interpreted, which is like a field of possibility. That's usually represented as chaos, or it's often represented as feminine. It's represented as the night. It has a terrible aspect and a positive aspect, because out of potential comes everything good and everything terrible. And then you have an active mediary agent that's an intermediary. And in the Christian conception, that's the logos, for example. The logos is the active principle that mediates between the forces of order and chaos. And this conceptualization makes a lot of sense to me phenomenologically, and I think it actually maps on quite well to the neuroscience. But the reason I'm giving you this lengthy exposition as part of this question is because it's relevant to this issue of separating consciousness from being. So I don't see how you can separate consciousness from being, even in principle, because I don't understand what it would mean, and you alluded to this, what it would mean for there to be a reality without awareness. Now, that doesn't mean I understand anything about what awareness is, but I don't think it's distinguishable from the problem of being itself.
Well, I think you're in very good company. Bertrand Russell thought this. Darwin thought this. Philip Goff, Galen Strawson, Muriel Bahari. There are a lot of people who share this view that you can't separate consciousness from being, and that being as a whole, whether that's cosmos, existence, God, the divine as a whole, has to have the property of consciousness. And I suppose that is slightly separate from intelligence in the sense that I can imagine some large language model being intelligent, or some, let's say, on the physicalist worldview, you could imagine some insect being intelligent in the way that it responds to its environment without being conscious. That's conceivably. I don't think that's the case in the world as it is, but you can conceive of such a thing. So you can pull them apart conceptually. But what I think is interesting is this seems to me to tie into, well, what I understand to be your wider view. And I think perhaps it would be good to just get that on the table so you can see the comparisons there. I find it a little bit difficult to follow some of the language you're using there. So excuse me if I oversimplify this for the sake of trying to keep it clear in my mind. It seems to me that your view consists of essentially three broad propositions. Those propositions are something like, one, when we perceive the world and act in the world, we're making value judgments. Like, the reason I see you now is because I value this conversation, right? Rather than seeing some other thing out of the infinite ways I could see the room before me. The second is that you think these values exist on a great chain of being, on Jacob's ladder. They emanate the form of the good, or they lead to an Anselmian conception of the divine, or something like this. And third is that I believe you think something like this, and I'm eager to hear any clarifications, is that you see story or fiction and scripture as tapping into the divine, tapping into truth or goodness, whatever that thing is that exists on top of Jacob's ladder. And to link to our discussion on consciousness and being there, that the greatest being, or the fullness of being, the thing that sits on top of the ladder, must be conscious and must be the totality of being. And again, that seems to run through the entire history of Christian philosophy, and maybe philosophy more generally. So I wonder, did you think that captures it? And am I getting the bits and pieces in the right order there?
I'm taking 4 of my esteemed colleagues and you across the world. Oh, wow, this is amazing. To rediscover the ways our ancient ancestors developed the ideas that shaped modern society.
It was a monument to civic greatness.
To visit the places where history was made.
That is ash from the actual fires when the Babylonians burned Jerusalem from 2,500 years ago.
To walk the same roads.
We are following the path of the crucifixion.
And experience the same wonder.
We are on the site of a miracle.
What kind of resources can human beings bring to a mysterious but knowable universe?
Science, art, politics, all that makes life wonderful.
And something new about the world is revealed.
What? Oh shit, this guy has balls.
Well, I think you've got the bits and pieces in the right order with regard to conceptualizations of the divine. I mean, let's take that apart a little bit, because that's very much worth delving into. So, in principle, the postmodernists, their ethos is defined by so-called skepticism towards meta-narratives, right? So their proposition, this was Lyotard, but it was shared, well, it's one of the defining characteristics of the postmodern school, I would say, is that there's no overarching meta-narrative, skepticism toward meta-narratives. And that actually, I find that, what would you say? It's a puerile idea. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, and you can tell me what you think about this technically, is that every perception and every action requires a unifying ideal. So, for example, if I want to lift a glass of water to my mouth, I'm unifying a tremendous number of unbelievably complex operations in order to do that. Now, it seems simple in some ways to my consciousness because I'm operating slightly above what I have automatized neurologically. And so I don't really have any conscious idea of the complexity of the molecules and the atoms and the cells and the muscles even that I'm using to move. But I'm unifying all those with regards to a value-oriented purpose. And that would be to quench my thirst. And then that would be nested in a higher order structure of values, because I'm quenching my thirst, I presume, because I believe it's better not to be thirsty, not to be in pain. I believe it's better to be alive than to be dead, etc. And like, so even that unifying, that micro unity of a given action unifies all sorts of things that are subordinate to it, but it also partakes in a higher unity. And what the postmodernists seem to be claiming is that you can just draw some arbitrary upper limit to that unity. And so then let's go there for a second. Okay, so there's no overarching meta-narrative. This would be, I suppose, in some way, skepticism about God. There's no upper unity. Okay, so what's at the highest level then? Disunity? Like nothing? Well, nothing is a stupid answer, because if it's nothing, you can't unify. And if it's disunity, then really what you've done is you've developed a metaphysics of discord and disunity. And you also have done it arbitrarily. It's like, okay, so you admit to the existence of the uniting narrative that allows you to drink from a glass, but you don't admit to the uniting narrative that enables you to live in harmony with your wife? Like, where do you draw the line exactly? And exactly is the issue. Like, you don't just get to say, well, there are micro narratives and meta narratives, and we don't believe in meta narratives. It's like, first of all, there's not a qualitative distinction. So, like, what exactly are you talking about? And second, if there's no uniting meta narrative, then what the hell do you think's at the top? Because it's either unity or discord. Or nothing, I suppose. And then you're in this nihilistic catastrophe that seems to do nothing but demoralize and cause and wreak havoc. So, okay, so you mentioned Jacob's ladder. It's like, well, it seems to me that the monotheistic insistence is that all goods unify towards something that brings everything together, which would include but even transcend consciousness, right? Because God would be beyond consciousness, beyond unconsciousness. But certainly one definition of God is what stands at the highest level of unity. Now, well, so we can bandy that about a bit.
Well, I wonder, just to ask you then, at the top of Jacob's ladder then, you take God to be there. You take God to be the thing on which all values hang on, / the thing that grounds all other values. To be clear, are you happy to say that? To say, I believe in the existence of God as the greatest conceivable being, let's say?
Well, I think it's in some ways it's a matter of definition. I guess it's a matter of definition. So because before we can talk about whether or not God exists, we should have some sense of exactly what it is that we're talking about. In the moment, we're talking about the highest conceivable potential unity. But then I would also say, so it stands at the top, but it also stands in the top in a peculiar way. And this is definitely insisted upon in the Judeo-Christian canon, because God is inconceivable and ineffable. And so even if you do put him at the top, as you approach him, he recedes, and that capacity to recede is infinite. It's also not within the scope of conceptualization, right? I mean, the classic atheists, they perform a sort of sleight of hand, and what their God is always the wise old man in the sky who's the superstitious obstacle to the progress of science. But that's not at all how God is conceptualized in the biblical corpus. I mean, God is put at the top of Jacob's ladder, but he's also ineffable and receding.
Well, let's pick up on a few of those ideas then. The first thing I think that's worth pointing out is, obviously, as you've said there are conceptions of God in which God is ineffable. And there's a big debate, as you know, there in philosophy of religion, to the extent to which God is ineffable. Some people take God to be completely ineffable. You can't say anything positive about God. You can only say what God's not in this view. So God's not a pineapple. God's not an Adam Sandler movie. And thank God for that. And God's not this delicious beer to my side or anything like that. So I can say negative things about God, but I can't say anything positive because God's beyond my own descriptions. But I think the majority of philosophers of religion agree that you can say some things about God. Descartes gives the example of trying to get your arms around a great mountain, and the great mountain is God. You can't understand God in his entirety, but you can pick up a few rocks, you can describe a few rocks and say, hey, this is the property of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, consciousness, being immutable and unchanging, and the like. And so I think there are some things we can reasonably say that God must have as part of God's essence. On this question of, well, let's go. There are some things that we can just pause for a moment. Some things we can say about God's essence, such as this. Right. Okay. Just finally on this, because I know that you know your scripture very well. I don't know my scripture certainly as well as you do. I'm more from the camp of perfect being theology. And as you know, there are three major strands of theology and philosophy which all try and arrive at a different or the same definition of God, really. Revelation theology looks at religious experience and scripture and tries to infer properties from God from revelation. Creation theology looks at God's hand in the world and says, well, God must be powerful enough to create the world, good enough to give us the world, and knowledgeable enough to give us such a finely tuned universe. And then when we look at other versions like perfect being theology, and this is the version I think is the most reflective of God, is that God, by definition, must be the greatest conceivable being. If there is a greater being than God, then the thing that you're talking about that isn't the greatest thing isn't God. God must have all great-making properties, that is power, goodness, knowledge, and anything else we take to be intrinsically great at the top of Jacob's ladder. If God has those things, then it is worthy of the name God.
Think your online activity is private? Think again. Even in incognito mode, your internet service provider, mobile network, and Wi-Fi network admins can see every website you visit. That's right, your school, boss, or even your parents could be tracking your digital footprint right now. But there's a solution, ExpressVPN. It reroutes all your internet traffic through secure encrypted servers, making your browsing history invisible. Rated #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge, ExpressVPN is incredibly user-friendly. Just open the app and click one button to protect yourself. Plus, it works on all your devices, phones, laptops, tablets, you name it, so you can stay private wherever you go. I use ExpressVPN because it hides my IP address, making it nearly impossible for third parties to track my online activity. I finally feel in control of my online privacy, and as someone who values their freedom online, this makes ExpressVPN a must-have. Protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/Jordan. That's expressvpn.com/Jordan, and you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/Jordan.
Okay, so with regards to the argument about ineffability, Mircea Eliade points out one of the consequences of a God that's too ineffable. So a God that you can't characterize this, and he's mapped out the death of God phenomenon across many cultures and over many times. And what you often see happening when a culture emerges and begins to flourish is that there's a revelation at its beginning, interestingly enough, that has a certain amount of psychological and sociological energy, and it unites people. It offers them a framework of meaning that quells their anxiety, and also a goal or a destination that imbues them with positive emotion, and that pulls a culture together. And then it happens upon occasion that the pinnacle value that's posited by that culture comes under rational assault, or perhaps falls prey to conflict with other religions, and people start to doubt and the system decays. The death of God, let's say. Well, Eliade pointed out that a God that is so ineffable that nothing can be said about him tends to float off into, what would you say, into the cosmic ether and lose his connection with humanity. And so I think it's better to think about it as in a hierarchical manner. And so here's one way that I've come to understand it that's both neuropsychological and mythological at the same time. So, in the story of Exodus, Moses is compelled forward to take a position of leadership as a consequence of his encounter with the burning bush. Right? And the bush is a tree. It's the tree of life, and it's on fire because it's alive. And a burning bush is a representation of that which calls you forward. That's a good way of thinking about it. Now, that takes concrete form in your life, right? So you might be attracted to a particular lover. You might be attracted to a particular profession, or a particular book on a shelf when you walk into a library. It's like a light turns on and you're called forward to it like a moth. And then as you mature and you transform and the way that you look at the world changes, the thing that compels your interest transforms. But then you could imagine something at the bottom of that that's constant across all those transformations, that's like the spirit of calling per se. And it spirals you upwards in a developmental path, and it recedes as you move towards. Now, that's one characterization of God, particularly in the Old Testament, is God as calling, right? And that's reasonably well mappable, I would say, onto the neurological systems that mediate positive emotion, because the positive emotion systems do call you forward. They fill you with hope. They fill you with enthusiasm, which is a word derived from the phrase for being possessed by God. But you can kind of understand that behind all the things that call, proximately, is the spirit that calls transcendentally. And you could think of the essence of that spirit as a closer approximation of the divine. That's not a full characterization of the divine, because in the Old Testament, for example, you also have God as the voice of conscience, which is quite different. That's more of a restrictive voice or impulse, so to speak.
This is good, though, because I think that these things that are in Scripture, whether Scripture's revealing truths or it's revealing moral truths and the like, whether it's revealing symbols, I take your view to be they're reflecting the divine. As Schopenhauer would put it, Schopenhauer's view of aesthetics was that when we're having an aesthetic experience, it taps into the rhythm of what he called the will. So you're tapping into the form of aesthetic beauty, which I think your view is sort of similar to there in terms of scripture. There's certainly parallels at least. But what I think is interesting from a philosophical point of view is, and I think for people more generally, is whether these events are concrete in the sense that they're historical events, and second, whether or not you do take this God to be a perfect being, like the God of Anselm, the God of Aquinas, the God of Augustine, like the classical conception of God. Because I think there are a lot of Christians out there at the moment that are holding you up and saying, look, Christianity's back. Here's Jordan Peterson saying he's a Christian. And here's him talking about scripture. Like, new atheism's dead. And here we are with the resurrection of Christianity. But I don't think you're the type of Christian which they have traditionally had in mind, for sure. My colleague at Durham University, Philip Goff, he's either coming out, or maybe I'm going to be coming out for him here, as a heretical Christian. And he thinks you don't have to believe in a perfect God, and you don't have to believe that the Christ event was a real event in order to be a Christian. There is a middle way between God and atheism, and that's my view as an agnostic as well. There is a middle way. It's just different to perhaps yours and Philip Goff's. And I wonder, like, would you be happy to be characterized in that middle ground, in finding new radical solutions to what's been a very partisan debate between theists and atheists?
Well, I don't think that characterization is quite accurate, although I think, not in its details, but I think perhaps there's elements of the gist that are accurate. I mean, I suppose, you could say philosophically that I'm an existential Christian. Maybe that's a reasonable way of putting it, in that I think that I believe that the Judeo-Christian ethos is not an ethos of what would you say, a propositional belief. The propositional belief is a surface, and it's necessary, but only insofar as it's in accordance with something deeper. Just like your words should be in accordance with your actions, but your actions are the fundament. Now, the words shouldn't contradict that. And I'm not saying that words are trivial, because they're not, but the commitment to faith that's demanded by Christianity is an existential commitment. And what that means, it's an all-in commitment. And that's a definition. I mean, Christianity is actually an outline of an all-in commitment. It's a representation of that. And so now, with regards to God being perfect, well, in some sense, for me, that's a moot point, in a way, partly because with this Jacob's Ladder conception, it's enough for me to know that no matter how high I continue to climb, there won't be an upper limit. And I mean, hell is being characterized as a bottomless pit. And part of the reason for that existentially is because things, no matter how bad things get, and they can get very, very bad, you can make them worse. There's something you can do to make them worse. But I also think that that's true on the positive side, which is that if you follow your calling, let's say, and abide by your conscience, there's no limit to the upward trek. And I guess I would say that we've conceptualized belief improperly in our culture, and because of that, we're caught on a dilemma between the Enlightenment rationalists and the Christians, because we have a propositional dispute. But I would say, let's talk about calling for a minute. So,
well, can I just come in on that?
Please.
Because these are three fascinating points. I think we're into the detail and where things are perhaps different between your views and let's call them the analytic philosophers of religion, the people who are in the universities thinking about this question in detail. I think there are three things there, right? The first is that you said there that you can climb Jacob's ladder, but you'll go on forever, like you'll never reach it. And there are two ways of interpreting, I think, that statement. The one is that you, Jordan Peterson, and me, Jack Symes, can climb the ladder towards intrinsic goods, but perhaps we'll never reach what we might consider perfection, i.e. reaching the fulfillment of goodness, knowledge, power. We'll always be striving. But I don't think you can make a second claim, which would be that the ladder itself goes on forever, because ultimately I think you need something to ground or hang up those values onto. You need an intrinsic good at the end, a fulfillment of what is taken to be good. Mm-hmm. So I think of those two things.
And you need one that's understandable.
Completely agree. You need one understandable. But in terms of your the idea of God as perfection, again, this is just a side point of information. What's interesting is that Eugen Nagasawa and Catherine Rogers, two brilliant philosophers of religion, have claimed there has never been a philosopher of religion who has argued for anything less than a perfectly good God. And that's phenomenal. That's changing, as I mentioned a second ago. Maybe Goff fits into this view with a God of limited powers, or the God which, to go back to our earlier part of the discussion, a God whose consciousness underlies our world but is constrained by the laws of physics, let's say. There is a greater being than that, and it's a being that's not confined to the laws of physics. So we're in a really interesting part of philosophy and religion at the moment in our culture where that's changing. But the third point, and I think this distinction shows the difference perhaps between your thinking and my thinking on this, is that let's take that statement, I believe in God. For me, that can be taken in two ways, the focus being on belief. Either I believe in God like I believe in humanity. When I say that, I don't mean like there's a thing called humanity. I mean, there's a thing which I'm putting my hope in. There's something that I trust, i.e. humanity. But obviously there's a second way of taking that statement, which is I believe that this thing exists, like the concept of humanity or God. And so when you say you're an existentialist believer in God, I think you probably fall into that first category, that you take the leap of faith towards God, you trust God, you put your belief in God in that way, rather than making the propositional claim, there is some concrete entity that is satisfied and is true and described in the proposition there as a perfect being who's conscious, powerful, good, and the like. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the distinction?
I have a hard time understanding exactly how to get to the second without thoroughly dispensing with the first, or thoroughly arranging the first properly. So let me respond to that in a way that also addresses another issue that you brought up. So you said with regards to Jacob's ladder, and I described this like infinite upward climb, let's say, at least of human beings. You said, well, there has to be something at the top. So let me describe for a moment how I think that's dealt with, at least in part, in the combined Old Testament and New Testament canons. And I'll make reference, I think, primarily to the concept of the Logos. So there's an insistence in Christianity that, and Christ himself makes this claim, that he's the embodiment of the prophet and the laws. And this is a very interesting claim technically, because what you have in the Old Testament, and you already alluded to this, is a series of characterizations of God. Like it's not all the Old Testament is, but the narrative part of it is a sequence of characterizations of God. It's sort of like there's a human being in this situation, and this is what God appears like to him or her. And then there's a human being in this situation, and this is how God appears to him or her. And so the God of the Tower of Babel is characterized in a different manner than the God in the story of the flood. There's an underlying insistence that these are all manifestations of the same transcendent reality, but the characterizations differ. Now, there's a pattern across those characterizations. Now, Christ's claim is that he's the physical embodiment of that pattern. And it's an extremely interesting claim. I have a very difficult time dispensing with it, let's say on rational grounds. And this is an answer to the definition of what's at the pinnacle, at least insofar as that might be comprehensible by human beings. Because Christ, like Job, is the mortal man who says yes to existence in the most radical possible manner. And so to understand that, you have to take apart in some sense what that radical acceptance would mean if it was truly radical. And what it would mean is something like what was initially outlined in the story of Job. So Job is a good man by God's own testimony, and God essentially turns him over to the powers of evil so that they can have their way with him. And there's historical precedent for that idea because Cain invites in Lucifer to have his way with him. This is something that happens in the Old Testament canon, but in the case of Job, Job doesn't invite Satan in. God basically sicks Satan on him. And then everything that can possibly happen that's terrible to a person happens to Job. Not everything, but it's a close approximation. And Job's response, Job has two responses. Like, he's so tortured that his wife says to him, there's nothing left for you to do except shake your fist at the sky, curse God, and die. And she has reason, viewing his misery, to make that claim. And part of the claim, and this would be relevant to the discussion we will have about notions of the evil God, it's like Job is pushed past what you might regard as reasonable mortal limits. But he does two things that are extremely interesting. He refuses under great duress to lose faith in the essential nature of his being. So he says to his friends and to God, he says, look, I'm not a perfect man. I have the imperfections of a good man. But that doesn't mean that I'm deserving of the existential catastrophe that has visited me. It isn't a mere cause and effect consequence. There's an arbitrariness about it. And so I don't lose faith in myself as a being, no matter what happens to me, but I also simultaneously don't lose faith in the divine itself, even though all the evidence in front of me at the moment suggests that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and perhaps even unforgivable in its evil. Now, what happens in the Christian story, in the Passion, is that story of Job is magnified across virtually all conceivable dimensions, so that Christ is the archetypal figure who faces the worst life has to offer by definition, but also throws himself fully open to that. And so you might say, well, that's what it means to that he takes the sins of the world unto himself. So imagine that the proper pattern of being for a human being is radical, open-armed acceptance of fate. Not just acceptance, but welcoming. But then imagine, because the insistence there, it's a very interesting idea, is that the more radical you are in that willingness, the more what the Old Testament thinkers characterized as the Spirit of God is likely to dwell within you and walk with you through your trials. And I can tell you, as a clinician, I can't see a flaw in that argument, because one of the things we've learned in the clinical realm is that if you encourage people to face the terrible things that they're tempted to avoid, that their character develops radically and they become much stronger. And that's been discovered across all the fields of clinical endeavor.
I think this might be the point where we find some interesting disagreement. I think we've been getting along like brothers so far, but those brothers might turn out to be Cain and Abel when I give a couple of clarifications here. Is that it seems like your argument there is like there is one of putting faith in the divine, in believing in the sense I gave a moment ago, to trust and place your hope into something, in God in this example, despite evidence to the contrary, you might think, or despite punishment from a God who claims they are perfectly good. And that seems like an existential claim, and I believe it is an existential claim. But you put them the other way around a moment ago. You said, I can't imagine the first idea of belief I gave you I can't imagine the second idea of belief I gave you without the first, i.e. you thought that without believing in, putting in the trust or the hope in something, then you couldn't have the latter. But I think it's the other way around. I think you need to know that this thing exists before you put your belief or hope in it.
Stupid.
And so you could think of an example, right? Like, I believe in Santa Claus, i.e. I believe that Santa Claus will punish naughty children and be good to the good children, the children on his nice list. And you might think that's a reasonable thing to say I believe in, but it's not. There is such a thing called Santa Claus that exists. So it seems like you do need the latter there. Now, I have a couple of problems.
Might be this, eh?
Yeah,
that might be a dance.
Deeply related. There is certainly a dance if you take them both to be true, but I don't think you want to commit to the second one. So I don't think you can dance the dance that you want to. I think there's one person tangoing in that scenario. There's only I believe in God and make the jump. There's no and the proposition that God exists is true. You don't say that one, so I don't think you're welcome on God's dance floor. Let's say, but I have a hard time with what people who ask that question. People ask that question as if the statement exists is self-evident. It's weird, eh? Like, because when you're putting together a statement and one of the objects of the statement or the subjects of the statement is the ineffable unity of all things, you just can't cram another word in there like exists without introducing an equal mystery, because you're trying to make an equation, right? Does God have the properties of something that exists? It's like, well, you already have an implicit notion of what existence constitutes. It's part and parcel of the structure that's enabling you to ask that question. And I don't know what your theology of existence means. So when you say to me, I don't mean you specifically, but I could mean you too. It's like, does God exist? It's like, well, What's your conception of exist? I mean, that's what we're bandying about to some degree, right? It's the thing that's at the top of Jacob's ladder. Okay, well, that's not the same thing as a table. Right, it's a different kind of existence. There is something which is in the world, physical or non-physical, that fits that description. You might have a Wittgensteinian idea from the Tractatus, although it's outdated, that my language literally maps onto something that exists in reality. It doesn't need to be a physical entity. I can speak of conceptual entities like sets and numbers and the like. I can speak of things that I can conceive of existing non-physically, like souls and angels and God. So there are discussions to be had there, and an interesting one perhaps in terms of what we mean by exist. Why do we say that Harry Potter does not exist, but that God does exist if we don't know what the word exists means. Like there is something, though, call it exist or call it, I don't know, the gist, like give it whatever label you want. There is something that separates Harry Potter from God in the view of the Christian. They're not the same sorts of things. And I think that's important. Now, we can have a discussion about what that thing is, but I don't think we need to examine every tree to make our way out of the forest. We know generally what we mean by exist. I've said that God is the perfect being, and we both have a broad idea of what that might be. And to believe, we've pulled apart together two types of belief, to believe in and to believe that proposition's true. So on believing in God, trust and faith, Job's leap of faith, and yours as well, perhaps, is that it doesn't seem like that's consistent with an authentic existence in which one accepts the truth. I believe that one of your rules in your successful book is tell the truth and at least don't lie. And perhaps that starts with getting your own house in order first, that when you look in the mirror, you should tell yourself what's true and not believe in things that you don't know are true. Because if you don't know they're true, then you should suspend judgment on those things. And that's strongly my view. I'm an agnostic about being agnostic, and I'm almost sure of it, because I think there are very strong arguments for traditional theism. I think there are very strong arguments for atheism as well. But ultimately, because I don't have enough evidence for one side or the other, I think the authentic and perhaps cold, dark, and I suppose empty universe I find myself in is one where I'm striving to find that meaning, find responsibility, and find value. And that's a difficult task psychologically. And certainly with the Christian view you developed a moment ago, you get certainty, right? You get the ultimate cosmic purpose. You get strong, objective moral values. You get this story of the world in which you sit neatly in the place. Now, just to talk about this for a moment, because I think this is a really interesting point, is that those who are agnostic or like myself or who are atheists, they often say things like, oh, I feel so small in comparison to the rest of the cosmos. Like my life seems so insignificant and meaningless. And you sort of go, well, if you were as big as the world or as big as the sun or as big as the universe, would that make your life more meaningful? And sort of go, no, it wouldn't change it. So size doesn't seem to matter. And then you think, well, maybe it's because I only live for 80 years if I'm lucky. And compared to the 4.5 billion years of our world and the 13.8 of the universe, it seems like my life's meaningless in that context. And you go again, like, imagine you lived for 800,000 years or 8 million years. Does that give your life more meaning? It seems like it doesn't. Now, despite what my ex-girlfriend might tell you, it seems that size and how long you last isn't what's valuable in the context of meaning and purpose. The thing that's meaningful and the thing that we cry out for as agnostics or atheists is what Albert Camus referred to, as you know, as the absurd. We call out for meaning from a universe that's indifferent to us. As the philosopher Michael Hauskeller tells us, this version of the absurd threatens to rob us of our sanity. Here be lions and dragons. Here be cold and dark and emptiness. And that's uncomfortable, right? That you don't belong here, or it isn't obvious that you belong here. But I think that's, if we're going to tell ourselves the truth, that search for meaning in a world that doesn't obviously present us meaning is the world that we need to embrace if we're going to live honestly and authentically.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Bull market or bear market? Rates rising or falling? Inflation spiraling up or cooling down? If only someone could invent a crystal ball. Well, here's some good news. Over 38,000 businesses have found the next best thing. They've future-proofed their operations with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud enterprise resource planning solution. Imagine this: accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR all seamlessly integrated into one fluid platform. It's not magic, it's NetSuite. One unified system means one source of truth, giving you the clarity and control to make swift, informed decisions. With NetSuite, you're not just running your business, you're seeing into its future. Real-time insights and forecasting put you ahead of the curve. And when you're closing books in days instead of weeks, you're spending less time in the rear view and more time on the road ahead. Ready to turn uncertainty into opportunity? Your business crystal ball awaits. NetSuite by Oracle, because in business, fortune favors the prepared. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/JBP. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/JBP. That's netsuite.com/JBP.
Well, I can tell you what made itself manifest as evidence for me. So the first thing, I'll sort of put a prodroma on this account. And so you know that in the Christian Passion, Christ faces youthful, unjust death at the hands of his own people, under the thumb of a tyrant, let's say. And that's not the sum of the injustice of his death, but in some ways that's the essence. And that's a pretty rough account of mortal limitation. But that's not the whole story, because the other encounter that is part and parcel of the Christian passion is the harrowing of hell. And that's a more mythologized account, let's say, but it has equal existential significance, because the essence of the Christian passion is it's the transcendent story of the eternal serpent. That's a good way of thinking about it, is that what Christ is encountering is not only the limitations of mortality, but the actuality of evil. Okay, so now, and then you might say as well, and you could say this from a clinical perspective, that it's not possible to live in the world and be complete and grounded and upward striving in the best possible manner without contending with the issue of evil. You have to contend with your mortality, but that's not enough. And it might be that contending with the problem of evil is a deeper problem than contending with the problem of mortality. And that's saying a lot, because the former's no joke. Okay, so when I started my investigations 40 years ago or more, I was obsessed particularly with the problem of evil, and mostly from a psychological perspective. And the question for me, in a nutshell, I suppose, was, what's it like to be an Auschwitz camp guard who enjoys his work? And that's not a question that people usually ask, because they don't conceive of themselves as the sorts of beings who could do that, much less enjoy it. And that always struck me as dangerously naive. Anyways, the consequence of investigating that question was that I became, for whatever it's worth, unshakably convinced that evil was a reality. And maybe in some ways, like an undeniable and fundamental reality, something akin to the reality of pain. Now, what that did for me was highlight out something that was the reverse of that by implication. Because if you can imagine hell in its darkest reaches, you can posit the existence of something that's antithetical to that. Now, it's always been more difficult for me to conceptualize what might be the essence of good than it is to conceptualize the essence of evil. I actually think it's easier in some ways to put your finger on evil. But once you do that, there's an implication that immediately emerges, which is, well, there's some pathway to hell, obviously, since we can create it on earth and have done that repeatedly in our own private lives, say, and sociologically and politically. That strongly implies that there's a pathway in the other direction towards something that's the opposite. And that's been much more difficult to flesh out. But for me, that was the existential grounding of my belief in something approximating a transcendent good. At least the transcendent good is the pathway away from, let's say, the worst excesses of Auschwitz.
Yeah, this is good, because I'm with you on this. And I think, again, the majority of philosophers think that there is something called evil, but maybe they use different ways of describing it. It's interesting you described evil as pain there, but at the same time, we can cash out pain in terms of higher order goods that pain gives rise to. So, I take the injection, so I'm immune from X, Y, and Z, and, the pain was worth it. It wasn't a gratuitous or a necessary bit of pain. And so it's not evil in that sense. And likewise, when it comes to Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, the pain and the suffering of the individuals who died at the hands of these weapons or of these regimes were themselves the victims of what they might conceive to be as evil or as gratuitous suffering. But the Christian says something, well, they've said it for a long time, right? That there are theodicies and defenses that one can give on behalf of God to get God off the hook there, that it's greater to have free will and do these things than not. And people like Richard Swinburne, the popular philosopher of religion defending Christianity, he defends things like the Holocaust and defends the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And that's a real bitter pill for a lot of atheists and agnostics to swallow. I do think that these defenses and theodicies collectively can respond to the argument from evil, the evidential version, that is. But there is a new version. There are several new versions of the problem of evil that are coming out recently. And I think the most dangerous of all of them is what Eugen Nagasawa, a Christian himself, describes as the systemic problem of evil. And he says, a perfectly good God, the challenge goes, would not gear the system, rig the rules to give rise to life as evolution by natural selection. That's not a system that God would put in place. It necessitates the pain and suffering of countless sentient creatures, and there is no way of getting consciousness and intelligent life without them. Ultimately, he says that actually that problem's a big problem for atheists as well, because he thinks atheists, like Richard Dawkins, are what he calls existential optimists. They think the world is on the whole a good place, and they're happy and pleased to be alive. Yet the same person is happy to run the problem of evil against theists, but maintain their own optimism. So he thinks that if you're an atheist, you can't be an optimist and you must be a pessimist. But if you're a theist and you've got strong arguments for theism, belief in God, then you can appeal to this broader metaphysics, kingdom of heaven, God's ultimate plan and the like. And so the theist, he thinks, has the better hand against the atheist. But ultimately, I think that argument works against him. And Eugen's a philosophical hero of mine, so I don't say it lightly. But you know what they say, to borrow from Aristotle, Plato's dear to me, but dearer still is truth. I think he actually shoots himself in the foot, because I don't think it's reasonable to believe in a perfectly good God and evolution by natural selection at the same time. And there is questions to be asked there about, and this goes back to the start of our conversation, and working as part of the Inner Experience project at Durham University, we look at the conscious experiences of all things we consider to have capacities for subjective experience. And the question is, can these non-human animals experience pain and suffering in any way, shape, or form that we can? And I think most of us think that's the case. 90% of people in the UK.
It's the simplest biological explanation. Otherwise, you have to posit that the systems in animals that are akin to ours and very, very akin operate in some qualitatively different manner. And that's not a useful Occam's razor hypothesis. It's animals obviously experience pain. Look, from my perspective, the proper position with regards to especially complex animal existence is that you assume continuity until you can demonstrate discontinuity. That's the simplest explanation. Now, you said a bunch of things there that were interesting, so let me respond to a couple of them. So in the story of Job again, Job has every reason to shake his fist at God and die, to claim, in some sense, what the antinatalists claim, to claim that existence, like Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust, claims that the existential situation that characterizes reality is so dismal in its essence that it would be better if the whole thing was just brought to a halt. That consciousness itself, even being, is a reprehensible exercise in light of the suffering that's ultimately generated. Now, for Goethe, that was Mephistopheles speaking. And that's very interesting because, of course, Mephistopheles isn't one of the world's most positive characters. And so you might say, well, and by the way, Mephistopheles was a great hero to Karl Marx. And Mephistopheles does make this argument, and that's the spirit he stands for, is the adversary of being itself. Being is so rife with suffering that it's inexcusable in its essence. And that's, in some sense, that's the impetus to suicide, right? And it's understandable. Now, one of the ways that I've dealt with that, let's say, psychologically and conceptually, is to, I suppose it's a by their fruits you will know them argument. My sense is that if you take the seeds that grow from that, or the fruit that grows from those seeds, that those fruits are bitter and evil, that if you adopt the antinatalist perspective, and look, it's perfectly obvious why it's justifiable, because the world is saturated in suffering. And it isn't obvious to me that there's a way of balancing the evidence, so to speak, to decide on which side of the scales you would place your conclusion. Partly because how the hell do you weight the evidence?
Yeah.
Dostoevsky's, or go ahead.
This is great. This is an interesting point of agreement. And I'd like to have seen this come out in your discussion with Musk, because I think he pointed to a form of agnosticism to begin with. And then when talking about antinatalism, he said something along the lines of, it's obviously ridiculous to think that the world is just suffering. And to quote to paraphrase the late, great Dan Dennett, he said that we should only begin to criticize our opponents after we express their ideas in such a way that they go, oh, I wish I put it like that. That's great. And I don't think the antinatalist says everything is suffering, as you pointed out there. They say the world has more suffering than it does happiness, that all happiness and pleasure is bracketed in suffering and pain. This is the Buddhist idea, the Schopenhauerian idea, the views of David Benatar and David Pearce, the negative utilitarians who want to eliminate suffering. And that means, and I asked David Pearce this, a transhumanist, I asked him once, well, if you're a negative utilitarian and you think the moral goal is to remove suffering, why don't you just blow up the world? Why don't you just give us drugs that make us feel nothing? And he said, well, I don't think I'm going to get voted in if I say I'm going to blow up the world, but I certainly would like to do it. And it's like, you got to admire the honesty there, right? Maybe he should start telling a few politicians lies to get himself to what he takes to be the moral end. But ultimately, though, I think you're exactly right, that the problem with trying to quantify, measure the amounts of good and evil that's in the world is a hopeless project. We can't, and you mentioned evil God a moment ago. There's this popular challenge in philosophy of religion that says, look at all the good and evil in the world. Who's to say that God is good rather than evil? And that's the essence of that challenge. And it works because it's really hard to quantify these things, especially when you're not just counting pains, pleasures, happinesses and the like, but you're also seeing what goods and bads they ultimately lead to. You can play that game all day long. But there's one thing that the anti-antinatalist has up their sleeve, and that's to say that existence itself is intrinsically good. Existence and being sit at the top of Jacob's ladder. That given the choice, and take John Rawls, you mentioned Marx, let's use another lefty-looking political figure in political theory. John Rawls said, imagine you're behind this veil of ignorance and you've got to create the world. And we can change this a bit for the purposes of our discussion. Now, you're given the choice whether to bring in life and conscious beings and not. You don't know how much happiness, pain, pleasure they're going to experience, how much suffering they're going to experience when they're in the world. And he asks, well, we're asking on behalf of Rawls, would you bring things into being still, not knowing how much happiness and suffering they'd experience? I think we'd all say yes still. I think there is no person that I know of anyway that legitimately defends the intrinsic disvalue of life. Even David Benatar, the most prominent antinatalist, doesn't think that life is intrinsically bad. He thinks that the suffering and pain in the world overrides the intrinsic goodness of the world. And I think that is ultimately something that goes in the anti-antinatalist's favor.
When we think about wildly successful businesses, we often focus on their great products, cool branding, and brilliant marketing. But there's an unsung hero in their success stories, the business behind the business that makes selling simple. For millions of entrepreneurs, that business is Shopify. Shopify is home to the #1 checkout on the planet. And here's the not-so-secret secret. With Shop Pay, they boost conversions up to 50%. That means fewer abandoned carts and more completed sales. Our marketing team uses Shopify every day to sell our merchandise, and we love how easy it is to add more items, ship products, and track conversions. In today's market, growth-minded businesses need a commerce solution that's just as flexible and dynamic as they are. Whether your customers are browsing your website, scrolling through social media, or wandering into your store, Shopify ensures you're ready to sell. Ready to elevate your business? Upgrade your business today and get the same checkout Daily Wire uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/JBP today to upgrade your selling. That's shopify.com/JBP.
So, okay. So I guess my first response to that question to you as well is that it isn't obvious to me that the axis of happiness and suffering is the right axis of evaluation. We seem to believe that it's self-evident that it's, let's say, something approximating pleasure versus pain. But that is not the only, what would you say? Those aren't the only interpretive frameworks that are accessible. So I'll give you an example, a biblical example.
I can take whatever they throw at me.
We all have a destiny. The only question is, do you have the courage to face it?
don't want to get up close. Abrams, your team will count on your courage.
I have been blessed by the King.
It's not smart to get in my way.
I see. Stay safe out there. Welcome! Now go out there and impose your will.
Need to get patched up. I'll fight to the bitter end.
Back to base. Just for a moment.
They've taken an objective.
protection goes a long way.
They took out Mirage. This up. You're not stopping me. I know how to make an entrance.
An excellent. Well, someone's looking to make a statement.
Everyone in this side.
I'll burn all of you.
Nice, dude.
Meet your end! is waiting to be claimed. They've taken an objective. Our purple guardian has been destroyed.
Going back to the shop.
Exquisite, isn't it?
Okay, I'm ready.
Careful, Yellow, you're by yourself.
Our yellow guardian has been defeated. Let's go.
Shit, I was too greedy. Bebop is here in base. We'll deal with him.
Take a nap, kid. Our blue guardian has been destroyed.
Shit. I don't know if I should have killed Bebop or have it gone there.
They want to kill me. Ooh, nothing can stop us.
Going to push purple.
Stupid bean.
Nice, Kelvin. They're coming from blue again.
The urn has been dropped.
Let's stick together.
Get here, bitch! Come on, bitch! Get back, bitch!
Don't let up.
No one is untouchable. Save my ass.
Who the fuck is killing? No, Bebop again. Oh shit, they're in mid, boss. Anybody can go there? Fuck.
They got the rejuvenator. We need to be smart.
Okay, time to take other tactics. I'm going purple, full. Time to distract them.
Let's see what this book is.
Enemies have breached our stronghold.
Going back to base.
This is the end. I'm unstoppable. You won't kill me. They took out Kelvin.
Shit, they were up my ass, but they're outside of the base. Come on, guys, we can still win this.
Need more firepower.
Yellow Walker has been destroyed. The Rejuvenator has expired. I'll take all of you. Deliver the Earth.
A group is coming from Yellow. Paradox and Bebop. Okay, how can we deal with this shit? Everybody get ready. They're gonna push base again, but we can still win. I think all of us have, or the majority of us have an ult. GG guys, still good games.
I'm not afraid of the mob. Abrams, your strength will be a boon to your allies and a bane to your rivals. Should get some gear. They better run. I don't quit. From anywhere. Snake. punch me, and they're not gonna like what happens next. The spirit urn is waiting to be claimed. Face me. They've taken an objective. Got enough for the best gear.
Going to help them. Isaac going to help them.
Excellent work. I'm about to show you.
I'm going green now.
They've taken an objective. Brilliance is enough to us all, McGinnis.
I'm gonna help Blue again.
Somebody kill Hayes!
Going back to work on yellow.
Your enemies will curse your name.
Okay, go and drink. Good idea.
Is living up to his reputation.
Setting a bomb.
Let's kill the Green Walker.
Someone help me! Our purple walker has been defeated. Going Thanks for having me. Hell is happening?
I got enough ammo for the whole team.
Their dreams will come crashing down.
Go in blue, let's go blue and destroy blue. Oh no, wait a minute. Let's go kill mid boss. We're close. Anybody else wants to come?
I see people.
I'll take all of you. The spirit herb is waiting to be claimed. A rejuvenator is descending. Down, Wraith.
Got you, man. Still got it, babe. Still got it.
Work.
Going purple.
Here I come. I'll take
Ship, get on your back. Come on, back. Oh, fuck.
If you don't hate my turrets yet, you're gonna real soon.
Going green. Bebop and Dynamo are sneaking.
They cower before us. Stand and fight!
What, you think you hate me now? Just wait until I kill you again.
Going yellow now.
Have the rejuvenator for much longer.
I got us covered. Gotta get as many of these up as I can.
Come on! Death brings consequences once more.
Time to block them off.
Coming in!
Fuck you.
Nowhere to hide.
Let's see what this book can do. You can't stop us. The spirit is waiting to be claimed.
McGinnis, can you push purple? Or do you need a... Oh, fuck, you have Bebop. I'm going there.
The only way to face a problem is head on.
You wanna look who's ready for a 2 a.m. metro ride?
See what this book can do.
Let me show y'all how it's done.
Nice.
ours.
They're angry at me because they gang me like fuck. Let's go full on your nightmare bitches. I'm gonna be your worst nightmare bitches. Okay, gentlemen. Whoosh!
Gotta build me some weapons. Buddy, give me help.
I'll take you all on.
They're gonna come right away. They're all alive. Good. They got it.
This is the beginning of something beautiful.
No Walker has been destroyed. That's me. No.
Oh, just wait till I get it going.
He's waiting to be claimed. Our Blue Walker has been destroyed. Take all of you. It was inevitable. This isn't over yet. Good work, Abrams.
I see the golem.
I'm gonna push blue while they're distracted. They're going to enter in panic.
I'll hold as long as I can. Yes!
I only killed 2. I thought I could kill 4. Fuck! Okay, they're scared of me. The 4 of them came for me alone. What the fuck? The majority are on purple.
Is exposed. No one breaks me. Has arrived.
Swing by anytime.
You wanna kill mid boss again, McGuinness? Or what?
Let's go mid. Time for a little help.
Bebop's looking to hook someone.
The rejuvenator is descending.
Dynamo's in mid.
Got it, bitch!
Stand and fight!
She's out there.
You can't hide forever. You won't walk.
GG's.
Do you remember when I talked about this with Dragon Quest and a lot of the people were mad at me? It was a conspiracy and I was inventing problems. Here's the guy that agrees with me. This is an interview at the 2024 Tokyo Game Show. Former editor in charge of Dragon Ball, and then also the Dragon Quest creator. There was a lot of buzz about the costumes. It became a topic of discussion because they weren't exactly the same as they were back then.
As you might remember, Square Enix is doing a remake of Dragon Quest III, and some people were angry due to the very obvious censoring compared to the original game.
Yeah, big surprise. Yeah, the nerfs. What's wrong with it? Yeah. I don't really understand that either. Man, that's crazy. Never thought about that in the past. Yeah, true. Under the name of compliance. It's like an absolute god. And man, holy shit, an evil disguised as good. There's no such thing as content that doesn't make everyone uncomfortable. I think he means like there's always going to be somebody who will get offended about something. Because beauty and ugliness, good and evil are different for everyone. There's a religious concept from the West, especially in America, that influences their approach to sex education, right? Because there's a risk of lawsuits. The company also has to get insurance. Oh my God. Doing business with such a ridiculous country is really frustrating. Yeah, I bet it is. In Dragon Quest, you used to be able to... No way. Oh my God. In Dragon Quest, you used to be able to choose between a male and female main character. But now, you can't choose between a man and a woman anymore. We have to label... Yep, there you go. Type 1 and 2. Yeah. I really wonder who's even complaining about this. I've been wondering the same thing. The body types 1 and 2. The idea that we're going to take the distinction of male and female and we are going to replace it in order to appeal to 1% under the illusion of inclusivity by using vocabulary that no one uses and taking away the vocabulary. How does this make any fucking sense? It is so stupid. And I cannot express how much I appreciate these guys saying this. These are the creators. This guy made Dragon Quest.